Thank you very much for coming along tonight for our second HR for Good session. So we're here hosted by VisAbility, which you might know more commonly as Guide Dogs WA. So we've actually got Dr. Clare Allen, who's here tonight, who's actually going to be talking to us about leadership here and also about the changes that are coming through on the not-for-profit sector. And we've got Tammy Tansley, established local author and also HR guru, I think we can call you. And in our conversations about organising tonight, they did actually go off track reasonably early on, and we ended up talking about when the Chinese New Year was. The Chinese New Year is actually early next week, and I don't know if you know, but it's actually going to be the Year of the Monkey, so it's going to be an interesting time for us. So just as a bit of an icebreaker, or excuse the pun, a cookie breaker, I've actually got some fortune cookies, so we can actually have a little look at what the future may have in store for us this year. So if you'd like to take one and pass it on, and we'll see what wise words of advice or otherwise.
The person next to you is in trouble.
Yours was easy. Crack one as well. Oh, that's good. Good as well. What we see is what we look for.
Is there anybody here who wants to share their words of wisdom?
You will be happy by receiving good news.
I've got quite an interesting one here. You are careful and systematic in your business arrangements. Which is good to know. Any others?
I have one. A thorn defends the rose, harming only those who would steal blossom.
Any more to share?
Well, mine says, the choice lies between ideals or bread. That's a bit of fun. Dignity or survival.
Oh.
I think I'm going to have to get rid of the dignity.
Let's go for survival, yeah.
Mine says be most affectionate to that. So remember what
I'm not sure how to take my one. It says courage is going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm.
You got more to
What are you
come.
failing
Oh
on?
yeah! What does that mean, Claire?
Mine says good people do not need laws to tell them how to act responsibly, while bad people will always find a way around the law.
Fantastic.
Yeah, maybe so. I often get reminded that how great women are at multi-skilling. That mine says you should be able to undertake and complete many tasks.
Lovely. Well, thanks very much for sharing those, and we'll kick off the session. So feel free to carry on eating and just pop up, grab yourself a drink if you'd like to, and the bathrooms are just out down the corridor here. If you need to pop out, and we're looking forward to some really great dialogue in our last session. Lots of great discussion after our formal presentation, and we're looking forward to more of that tonight. So I will hand you over to Clare.
Okay.
So Dr. Clare Allen is our first presenter of the evening, CEO of VisAbility here, and has some fascinating stories to share.
Thank
Over to
you, Paul.
Clare.
That's fantastic. Can everybody see me quite well? Quite comfortable with me sitting down. I've never actually started a conversation when everybody's munching on these fortune cookies. But I'll try, because I'm audio digital, to try and block it out. But if you want to keep munching, that's okay. I might start speaking the same way you're munching, because Welsh people tend to do that. And so if you're trying to work out what my accent is, it's 20 years of trying to lose a Welsh accent so that I actually keep my credibility, because otherwise people think I'm singing at them, and that's really not a good thing at all. So as Pauline would have said, I'm the CEO of VisAbility. Been in CEO roles for quite some time. So if you like, I started in the not-for-profit sector, in the youth work sector, have worked in aged care, disabilities, economic development, facilities management, took a stint out in terms of the private sector in the social media space, looking in terms of business development, worked with lots of women in startup companies, and in the last organisation, took it from 2 sites to 11 sites across Western Australia, from 2,000 clients to 12,000 clients in a short space of time. And in this organisation, I'll tell you the story. So we'll go from there. So I purposely decided that I wanted to work in a well-known charity. That was important to me. I'd come from the employment sector, and the employment sector is all based around fee-for-service and actually, delivering those solid outcomes. And it becomes a very corporate environment. It's not like your traditional NFP. And I've always been about capacity building. I've won several awards for developing leadership programs in communities, and I'm passionate about it. And I found I was losing my soul in the employment sector. I was good at it, but I didn't really like who I was becoming, because I was so target driven that performance was really all I thought about. So I needed to step out of that. I needed to reflect and think about what I actually wanted to do. And it really came back to, well, actually, this is what's on the horizon in the not-for-profit sector. Now, when I actually, the last organisation, looked at change management, I positioned the organisation for growth, and there was no doubt in my mind that we wouldn't grow. I knew we would grow because I listened to what government was saying. I knew the trends and the analysis, and I tried to tell people in the not-for-profit sector what was going to happen, and people wouldn't listen to me. And I'm ashamed to say that I wiped out nearly the whole not-for-profit sector in the employment sector in a very short space of time. And I wasn't happy with that, because I was trying to wipe out the private equity companies. But in being so good at what I did, I actually wiped out the not-for-profit sector. And that was very, very hard for me. So while my staff, who were all very motivated, were celebrating, I remember sitting in the Irish pub thinking, oh my God, what have I done? And that was a reflection moment to say, here I've got to go to organisations like Mercy, who are good performers, and take over their business. And here I have got to go to Mission and take over their business, and their staff are all going to be made redundant. And so for me, it was like, well, I've got to see the organisation through this phase, but I need to actually go to an organisation where I can use those skills to make a fundamental difference. So the reality is, in the not-for-profit sector, and so you can believe me or not, it doesn't really matter to me, but the reality is there's only going to be a small number of providers left 5 years, 10 years down the track. Most not-for-profits are basically, very small in terms of their turnover, and those organisations that have cash in the bank of 3 months or more are around about 33%. And in actual fact, the recommendation is that you need 6 months operating cash to survive. There's a large number of not-for-profits in the eastern states that are actually going broke at the moment in the lower support area. How can you run your business on the money that is being given? 2018 has been a year that I have spoken about for probably about a decade now, because I've read every single reform of government, and they all mention between 2015 and 2018 that we're going to have significant reforms and changes across the health sector, the employment sector, and the disability sector. And people don't really read them. I do. And I understand that 2018 was the year where most block funding would be put under question. And we've started to hear the heralding of that from a number of government departments. And guess what? Most of our contracts only go to 2016 with an option for a year after 2016 to 2017 or 2018. It's no surprise to me that that is the case. And so I've always known, coming from the employment sector, that the model would be based on streams and income, and that it would be based on, if you like, high competition. So when we look at the latest data, what we're actually seeing is that the number of organisations cashed up is very few. And we're also seeing that those providers, only 12% are prepared to invest any money in their growth. So even if they've got money in the bank, only 12% are prepared to put any money into that. Secondly, if they're actually going to pay on outcomes, that means that, for example, in the UK, sometimes they don't pay for 3 to 6 months after you've achieved the outcome. In the US, sometimes it's up to 6 months. And over here, we've been having our money up front, and we think it's okay, we'll be okay. And even in my way, we get paid up front, and with, you know, basically looking at NDIA, we get paid in arrears. We have two different models in Western Australia. But the trend will be that we'll be paid in arrears. So automatically, those organisations that can't sustain the cash flow will have a problem, yeah? So these are really simple facts in the NFP sector, and a lot of people tend to bury their head in the sand, whereas I embrace them to build my business around that. So when I arrived at VisAbility, we were the Association for the Blind, and there were like several reports that said, we don't think that you should have the name blind because it's actually prohibitive. But nobody would make the decision to change the name. And everybody was afraid of the membership base and concerned that if we changed the name, people would get upset. So I like a challenge, so I decided the first thing I would do is change the name. You know, based on all these reports and all the evidence that was there, it was basically saying, first of all, optometrists, ophthalmologists weren't referring to us, because to say the word blind to a parent whose child's going blind was too daunting. So we weren't getting those people coming to us. People with low vision weren't coming to us because they weren't blind and they didn't think that we would give them help. So automatically we knew that we weren't targeting that audience. So we decided, let's open that up. So we've actually, in the last 3 years, we've had a name change, and we've become a company limited by guarantee. We've changed our membership structure. We've put in a new client management system. We've put in a new IT system. We've put in a new finance system. We've restructured all parts of our business, and we've actually closed down a number of our centres. And when I arrived, we had a $1.7 million of debt, and we only had $1.10 for every dollar of liability, and every single department was in deficit. Cultural change was screaming out. Within the first year, we became in surplus and we paid our debt off. Now, how did I do that? By getting staff to think about the cultural shift that needed to happen. The first thing I did is have a strategic planning day with the board and with basically the staff to talk about the PESTEL, the political, economic, social, technical, legal and environmental context. What's happening out there and what do we need to do to change? And once everybody knows the landscape, just as I've set the scene with you, they start to say, well, what if we don't become relevant? And then when you say, we have an over-reliance on bequests, how do I predict when somebody's going to die and leave me money? So how can I depend upon that money to build my business? But we've always relied on bequests. And we have organisations, other guide dog organisations across Australia that are 80-90% reliant on bequests. You know, we're not reliant on bequests, and 3 years ago we were 100% reliant on bequests. So we said next year I need that money, but let's only be 75% reliant. And the following year let's be 50% reliant. And within 5 years let's not be reliant on bequests at all. They're a bonus. We should be efficient in our services. And not only that, you walk into this building and it's a lovely building, yeah? Lovely building, $4 million worth of operating costs on a $12 million turnover. That's not easy. So you want to turn your business around and you have these high costs. So what does that mean? I have to grow. So you think about a not-for-profit, we don't make huge profit. We're for purpose, we make a surplus. To cover the costs on this building, I would actually need to triple my turnover just to cover the overhead costs. Otherwise, I'm going to be carrying around that amount of money for a long time in terms of trying to cover it. Make sense? Mm-hmm. These are just empirical imperatives, but I tell everyone. I have the conversation from a cultural perspective. How am I going to do that? How am I going to make these changes based on that? How am I going to pay these bills? So we've rented most of the top floor out. We've actually increased our unit pricing. We hadn't gone for growth funding for 4 years. We were too afraid to tackle government and ask for more money. So I just go and ask. I just go and say, we can't provide the services unless we get X. This is what I want. And you know, at one point in a not-for-profit, when I sat in as acting CEO, they hadn't had an increase in funding in, I don't know, a decade because they were too afraid to ask. So I basically sat them down and said, and I was told by the board as a directive in that not-for-profit not to go and ask for more money. And I ignored them. I was only acting, who cares if they sacked me? So basically, I sat in one meeting and I said, I want this, and they laughed and they said, it's about time you asked us. We don't know how you've been surviving this long. They went from a negative to a surplus overnight. And there are times where you think about your strategies and you have to be really smart about it. But we've an auditorium here, we've had several meetings in the auditorium where I tell the same story. I bring out the same data. I ask people how they can help, but I give them a vision. We are an organization that is in allied health services. We are to work with people who are blind and vision impaired as a priority, but we're going to expand to complementary disability services. And we will be an iconic, giant disability service organization in the space. People buy the dream, quite literally buy the dream. My job is to deliver on what I say I'm going to do. So from a cultural perspective, people tend to jump onto that. The guide dog program, here we were struggling with money, and you would think I'd cut back on the area that doesn't bring in any revenue. Yeah, I could easily tweak there. It hadn't had an investment for 5 years. You got to be kidding. I came here because of the guide dog program, so we put a 50% increase in funding into that. Now, most people wouldn't do that. They'd say, you're losing money, why are you doing it? Mission. If I can evoke in the hearts of people the philanthropy and get them to give more money, then guess what? I'm building that philanthropy. Why? Because many not-for-profits, and since I've arrived, I've had 7 phone calls from CEOs saying, how can I get into the charity space? Because they think it's all too hard now in the disability space. How can I get into the charity space? And I said, don't bother, we've got the dogs and the kids. Go somewhere else. So the reality is that you have to maximize your strengths as an organization, and you have to move away from the things that are actually not going to be long-term sustainable. So now we're in a position where we've got good operating cash, we have no debt, within 3 years we have a very solid vision, we've met all of our KPIs, we're ready to do our next strategic plan, all our horizons are met, it's strategic, we've invested also, a large sum of money into all these new systems. We've invested again this year and we'll continue to invest. We've got opportunities on the table with another merger, and they look at our finance and their board says, how the heck did you do this in 3 years? How did it happen? And I think, I don't know. I don't actually focus on the money. I just focus on the culture. I just empower people to do the very best they can possibly do. I've got a good idea of finances. I'm pretty smart, but at the end of the day, I just know what the unit price is. As long as we get the unit price, as long as we maximize efficiency in the best way possible, and as long as we turn things around in a way that people can cope with, it'll move faster. I can remember being in Mandra at the Performing Arts, and I was talking to the CEO, and he said, how did you get so successful in the organization I was in? I said, well, I just used the Australian Business Excellence Framework. I just follow that. I just follow a really robust format, because guess what? All the top organizations use a framework. Why wouldn't I do that? I'm not a genius. I just follow something that I know works and I apply it with all of my heart. Confucius says, wherever you go, go with all your heart. So where am I going? I'm not going to do it half-baked. I don't want somebody seeing our values on the wall and pulling them down and saying, oh, well, the CEO doesn't emanate them. I may as well give it all my heart. Yeah, while I'm there, give it all my heart to make that change management happen. So from that perspective, we've seen massive turnaround just by being honest and upfront. But don't get me wrong. If I don't believe in something, I will take a very firm stand. If I don't think that we should go down a certain area, I will say we're not doing it. And I'll say that very clearly based on empirical evidence. Why would I enter when I don't have, 2 years operating cash in the bank, the lowest support area? I'm going to focus on allied health. There's more money. There's less money for me to spend in terms of expansion. It's really simple. But there's a market. Of course there's a market. Let someone else do it. They're going to spend years fighting to get a higher unit price. I haven't got time for that. If I was in another organization highly cashed up, I'd make a different decision, yeah? So sometimes you just have to think about your environment and build your program upon that. Our staff, I have to say, are absolutely exceptional. They know everything there is about the blind vision impaired space. Our guide dog trainers are internationally trained trainers. My job is to keep them. My job is to make them feel worthwhile. My job is to acknowledge them and to actually stand on the stage and talk about how good they are in the space and recognize them. So I'm not afraid to do job shadowing or spend time with people or listen to their concerns or actually take their ideas on board and give them feedback and reward and recognize them. Because in this new world, it's not about the leadership at the top, it's a bottom-up approach. So that's really it from me, and then you can think about your questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I want to start off tonight by reading a very short story about change from William Bridges. The front runners take off like rabbits, and then the second rank, who are nowhere near as fast, get underway. By the time the leaders are well out on the course, the Sunday runners in the rear, who are too far back to even hear the starting gun, and who only hope to be able to finish the race, are beginning to stir. A rumour comes back through the crowd. The race has started. The Sunday runners move their feet a little to loosen up, but they can't get moving yet. They shuffle a little, they begin taking smaller steps. At about the time the Sunday runners have sped up to a slow jog, some of the front runners are nearing the finish line and thinking, oh, that's all over, great race, what will I do next week? And so it is with company executives. They went through their transitions long ago when they started grappling with their problems, and they forget that their followers are still struggling behind. Tonight I want to complement what Clare has said and talk about leadership. So I want to talk about leadership through times of change and how to do this successfully. And there are 4 takeaways I want to leave you with. How leadership is critical to change efforts, some very practical steps that you can take to enable change leadership. The one thing from my perspective that can unstick you, and I'll be interested in your view on that, Claire, and how we deal with resistance and timing issues. So we know that change is the new constant. It's no longer something that happens occasionally. It happens continuously, often with multiple changes at once, and rarely with time to recover and celebrate one change before the next is upon us. We also know that research tells us that change is poorly managed, poorly implemented, and usually quite poorly led. Time after time, we hear about failed IT systems, mergers and acquisitions that don't deliver on their value, and expensive systems where people continue to use their old systems and have Excel spreadsheets just to manage. The cost of this poorly managed change is huge, not just in the failed implementations, but in the inefficiencies that come and the workarounds that come with it, in people not doing exactly what it is that they're meant to be doing as a result of the change. One example I'd like to give you is of the Sydney City Cross Tunnel, which from a project management perspective was an outstanding success. It was ahead of its time and unbelievably under budget, almost unheard of. And yet it is widely considered to be a complete failure because the public, even 10 years later, still don't use it. They will go out of their way, taking routes that take longer and cost more to avoid using it because of the way that it was implemented and led and managed and foisted upon them. So that's one cost of poor leadership. There's another cost, and that's one that's harder to quantify, and that is the reduction of trust in the leadership of an organisation every time a change is mooted but is inefficiently or ineffectively introduced. And in organisations with a history of failed implementation of change, you can almost hear the, oh, here we go again. Or if I just lay low long enough, this too shall pass and we can go back to how things used to be. And every time that happens, there's just a little bit reduction of trust, and it's just a little bit harder when the likes of a Clare comes along to try and introduce them. In the not-for-profit sector, when many organisations are seeking to introduce change and to bring a degree of commerciality that Clare was talking about, and with a multitude of sector changes such as the hack funding and various other things, there is a real sense of urgency around change, particularly the figures that you were citing, which are frightening. Being able to introduce it now successfully is more critical than ever. The good news is, from my perspective, we know what works. Claire's talked about what works, and we know what leaders need to do to introduce change successfully. And the even better news is that none of it is particularly rocket science, I don't think. So I want to talk to you about some practical things that you can do in your roles to support change leadership. To have a single, clear, compelling story about the change, to communicate, and communicate more, and to reward and recognise the successful implementation in a way that's appropriate for your particular organisation, including that change is incorporated into any KPIs or goals for the particular individual. Let me elaborate a bit more. To have a single, clear and compelling story about the change, or as Clare said, to buy the dream. What is the change, and more importantly, why the need for change? As Simon Sinek says in his now infamous TED Talk, start with why. And here's where it goes a little bit astray. Firstly, as I mentioned before, it's rare that there is one singular change being introduced. Often there are multiple changes happening at the same time, started at different times, with different people, with different agendas, and consequently, mixed messages. One change often contradicts the why of another change, and it becomes messy and confusing, which is why you need to have a singular, overriding why, a sense of purpose, a reason for getting out of bed in the morning. And you can link this change and any other change in a way that is simple and clear for the people who are meant to be implementing it. A story that's clear and compelling, that makes sense, that can be told over and over and again without losing its clarity. As Claire said, she stands up in that auditorium over and over again and tells the same story. A story that paints a postcard for the future, a story that creates hope rather than fear. Secondly, communicate the change, or as Claire said, to have the conversation. We know that successful change is communicated over and over and over again. It's communicated in different channels using different forums at different levels of the organisation. And it answers these questions. Why the change? What is the change? What's changing and what will stay the same? What does it mean for me, the individual, and what's in it for me? We know that employees want to learn about long-term changes about the most senior of leaders, and then what the impact of that is on them from their manager. So communication needs to take into account different versions of the same stories at different levels. Managing change is everyone's responsibility, not just the top leaders. We also know that leaders make two mistakes around communicating change. One is to think, oh, we've already told them that, and that is sending out 1 or 2 emails. Or secondly, not communicating because there's nothing to say or things haven't moved on. So both of those can be easily rectified. The third thing that you can do from a practical perspective is to reward and recognise the change. And this is about making sure that the goals and targets and reward and recognition of the leaders are linked into the strategic plan, as Claire talked about, and that they take into account the changes that are being implemented. I think far too often in the not-for-profit sector, there just aren't the tangible links. And then organisations get surprised when leaders don't go about doing what it is that they are being asked to do from a change perspective, and that's because it's not linked to their KPIs. We know what gets measured gets done. So that's the practical steps that you can take to create change leadership. I wanted to talk to you about what can unstick you. You can do all of the above and still not implement change effectively, and that is because you don't have commitment from the top team. Commitment to the change from the top means having all of the team on board. And again, Claire, I'd be interested in your view on this. This means having a clear champion for the change on the leadership team and having consistent support for the change from all the leaders on the team. It means being put on the top of every agenda. It means visible leadership, the leaders walking the talk, talking the talk consistently and regularly. And it means the right people being on board with the change. And here's where it gets tricky, because particularly in the not-for-profit sector, where you've got a number of managers who've been around for a very long time in an environment that's going through a process of evolution and self-renewal. We know there's one thing that is glaringly obvious though, and that is that a leader cannot affect change without having the right team around him or her. Too often leaders try to implement changes in spite of their leadership team rather than with their team, and then wonder why it doesn't work. It is absolutely pushing it up a hill if you're fighting against those that are meant to be on your side and helping you, as well as trying to convince those in the rest of your organisation. Now this can lead to a conundrum. What do you do if someone just won't get with the program? If they're a reasonable contributor in any other way, but for the fact that they are just not getting on board with the change? Or worse, that they consciously or subconsciously just block the change? Ultimately, when reflecting on changes that have been successful, it is almost without exception that the whole leadership team has been on board and is visibly supporting the change. Even if privately a leadership team member has reservations, there is a tacit agreement that any such dissent will be done behind closed doors, and that there will be a public face of unity and support for the change. Of course, this is easier said than done, but it comes down to the degree to which you want the change to be successful. It's unlikely to be successful if members of your team are going about actively or passively detracting from the change effort. And so if the change is important, there are decisions that need to be made. Sometimes this is just about better explaining, persuading, clarifying the change to the relevant leadership team member. Sometimes it's about explaining their crucial role in leading the change. Sometimes it's about listening to their dissent and building in their objections if at all possible. Sometimes it's about giving them a more critical role within the change effort. But sometimes, as good at their job as they may be, it might be that they are not the right person for the job if they ultimately can't get on board and support the change. Problem comes when these people undo all the good work being done by the leader, where the leader has got the singular, consistent story, they've got the communication, they've got the link between reward and recognition. But if there are members of their leadership team who either tacitly or explicitly don't support the leader, the change will be so much harder to introduce. Finally, I just want to talk about a couple of other practical things that you can do through leading through change. And that is about resistance. People often think that resistance or resistors are a bad thing, but I actually think the reverse is actually true. If you listen closely to what the resistors are telling you, it may tell you that your story, that compelling story we talked about earlier, is not compelling enough, or that there isn't sufficient information on the impact on employees or the individuals, or that they can't make the link with what's in it for me. Sometimes resistors are just pains in the butt, but often it is that they actually have a valuable source of information, and we would be wise to listen to what they've got to say. The other question that people often ask is about timing of change leadership and why it always takes longer than we think it's going to. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. And one is that we get very excited about change and we want to leap into it without insufficient planning and preparation. And there's so much thinking that needs to go on about the impact, about the story, about linking it with the systems that we don't do. But I think that's false economy, and almost always it costs you more in terms of time with the reworking. I think the other thing is that leaders often, Clare being a very notable exception, can be removed from the everyday impact of what it means for an individual and the need for individuals to go through the change cycle of sorts. And so think back to the story of the front runners, they're already there and they forget that employees need to go through the cycle. So back to that story we started with. What can you do to make sure you're not a front runner leaving the others behind? You have a single compelling story that you communicate over and over again in different ways and at different levels. Be committed to the change in a highly visible way. Reward and recognise successful implementation in a way that's appropriate for your organisation, ensuring that it's part of any targets or goals and that's linked to the strategic plan. Prepare and plan, and listen to the resistors. They're not all bad. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Clare and Tammy, for your wonderful and insightful words there. I'm sure there's some great thinking content there in terms of what's happening in your organisation and what's happening with your leaders. And also something for you to reflect on is that we're all leaders in some form or other. We don't have to have direct reports or a formal leadership title as such. There's all things that we're doing to role model behaviours and the culture of our organisations every day. Now, we've got plenty of time left in this session, because one thing we try and do within these HR for Good forums, if you haven't been to one before, is have a lot of discussion and debate, because we've all got such unique circumstances in our organisations, and so I'd love to actually hear from you guys how things are going at the moment, if you've got any particular burning questions that you'd like to ask Tammy or Clare, so feel free to fire away. Otherwise I'll ask a question.
So David Stroud. One of the things I'm quite interested in, I guess, from a leadership and change perspective is the role. So when you're going about and you've got a compelling vision, you know there's some urgency, but is there sort of a conscious sense of designing a process and designing a way that you're going to shift your organisation and how you move the parts of the organisation, how you design interventions, or, you know, rather than sort of just evolving it over time. If we're working in a framework, then we want to design. Yeah. And I guess because it's not, from one angle it looks like, well, this is just what I thought.